If I was going to define my method, because so I brought along eye tracking stuff and so on to talk about because eye tracking is relatively well known, but I also do, for example, ultrasound investigations of tongue movements in language production, and I also do a lot of electroencephalography, which is not a word I like having to pronounce. I just say EEG for now on. Okay. So I'm going to define myself, which I don't like doing, as a measurer of implicit behaviour. What I do then is I extrapolate from that implicit behaviour to try and find out what's going on in the mind that, normally speaking, has to do with language, but doesn't have to.
So methods I've used include everything from artificial grammar learning, invented language learning, using Basque as the target language, which wasn't one they knew, literacy, different kinds of literacy studies. I've also done things on strategies and Likert scale stuff that psychologists don't go near.
If this were an elevator,
what
would you say your research interest was? I mean, you said multilingualism.
Yeah, cognition about languages.
Cognition about languages?
Yes.
Okay.
So how do multilinguals process their languages? What is it that they learn to do through learning languages?
So what sort of natural investigations?
So, for example, tests. So people have to learn another language.
Right.
They get tested on the language, and I test what it is that they've learned about the language. Can they tell me about the grammar that they've learned?
Okay.
Or is it just they know the words and they manage to put them together somehow, but they don't really know what they're doing with the grammar?
So it's kind of explicit versus implicit knowledge about
It's what
language.
they know about what they're doing.
Okay.
Rather than psychologically, it's like what you know, but they may not know. If you know what it is that they learn to do in the process of learning their languages, you could then support them better if you're teaching.
Okay.
In knowing what to provide them to assist them.
And is this largely, so is this numbers? Is this quantitative data or is this qualitative?
Quant.
Pardon? This
Quant,
is quant.
yeah.
So if I were a participant in one of your experiments, what would you do to me?
Get you to learn another language and ask you how you're learning it in the process of how you learn it.
So that would be a kind of like almost Wundtian armchair type thing.
Yeah.
Or
you could join a class.
Okay.
I've done a study on heart rate, measuring beginner teachers' heart rate and comparing them to their learners' heart rate and an observer's heart rate.
Okay.
You know, those first few classes that people teach, they are totally anxiety-ridden. It's like brain overload. They're trying to think of what they're trying to teach, the content, the methods that they're using. Think of classroom management at the same time.
Right, yeah. These would be teachers teaching who typically?
Our students teaching us. So they were teaching their mother tongue using the methods that we...
That's a really interesting thing to do, I think.
But very stressful. Imagine teaching your teacher.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can take self-reports of anxiety. I think you said you took heart rate monitors, right? At one point.
We were interested in the heart rate of not just of the new teacher, but also the learners, because the learners pick up on the stress of the teacher. And the next week's teacher was the observer, so they observed the class before they taught it.
Okay.
Because every week there was a different teacher. So we're kind of triangulating because we have the 3 data points.
Right.
And we have the video data of the class.
Okay.
And then afterwards we've got interview data for all 3.
A lot of coding. Yeah.
It is. So we're trying to relate the transcript of the video to the heart rate, like a dual analysis.
Right. You might associate anxiety with gaze avoidance, for example, right? So if I'm an anxious teacher, I'm not going to look at the students I'm teaching as much as if I'm less anxious. I wonder. So what I suppose I'm wondering is, if you were to put me into your job, my approach would be, obviously, it would be informed by what I know, so it wouldn't be informed by the same decisions that you've made. And I thought it might be interesting to think about how I do it, given the methods that I have at my disposal, as it were. I'm sure you've seen one before, but effectively, it's just like a webcam. Actually, it looks very posh, but it's a webcam that's tuned to infrared, and that's what it is. Okay, and so the costs are like marked up webcams, effectively.
Right.
So this costs £80.
Camille.
Yeah, sure.
Wow.
Yeah. Can be clipped to the bottom of a laptop or something quite easily, or just put on a little tripod in front of a computer if you're interested, where people, at that sort of price, you could almost suggest that students acquire them. It's pretty much within the range of expensive textbooks prices now. So eye tracking, I suppose, let's use it as an example of a sort of implicit measure of behaviour.
Yeah.
Right? So People do obviously have some control over where they look, but generally speaking, your eyes will, and it's quite interesting, right? So they will follow where you're attending. So your attention tends to shift first, and then your eyes kind of lock on to what's caught your attention, if you like. And language is a very good director of attention, okay? So, you know, if I talk about my hand, then the chances are that at some point you'll glance at my hand. No, you did, sorry. But you know, you're going to do that for that kind of reason. And so you can use language as one of the drivers to see kind of how people are interpreting things. So, you know, a very general way of doing an experiment, it would be to have an ambiguous word, let's say, right? You know, so let's have the word bank, right? And you draw a nice picture of a financial institution and a nice picture of the side of a river. You utter the word bank, and you look at where people's attention is drawn, okay? And that gives you some implicit information. So they're not, you know, they might be well aware that this is an ambiguous word, but implicitly they're likely to favour one of those images over another, let's say, and that would give you some kind of information at an early stage about what they were understanding.
Using the eye tracking in the classroom, have you tracked, for example, teachers and whether students are looking at teachers?
Well, we've done a little bit
and where
of
they're looking at the teacher.
We were just interested when we put up overheads in, you know, where the most informative regions of the overheads are. So, you know, a lot of, at university level, a lot of teaching involves standing next to an image and pointing at bits, and, you know, we were just interested where people were looking when we were saying certain things. It would have taken an awful lot of eye trackers to get that information. But what we did was, every now and again, the slide that we were displaying would be replaced by just a grid with numbers on the grid, and your job was to write down the number that you saw. And taking those numbers, we were then able to create a heat map, okay, so show where people were looking at the number most often and so on, and to get some idea.
So where were they looking?
Well, we did this in two ways. So first we did it like that, and it wasn't that interesting, you know, if you say look at the graph, they were looking at the graph, right? Big surprise. But then we did a videoed lecture, so you also had the lecturer there. The problem with this is that we don't have enough evidence yet, because if you do it that way, you can only do it like 4 times in a lecture, right? Because otherwise people are just not, you know. So we don't have enough temporal evidence, but we can tell about half the class are looking at the picture, about half the class are looking at the lecturer. So all of that is kind of, you know, the beginning of a way that you could do quite a mass educational thing to see what information is useful to evaluate proficiency in some way, okay, rather than as some sort of driver of teaching. Now, you could.
I'm more interested in process.
Okay, you're more interested in process.
Yeah, how? How is it that they're learning, and how can we teach better? There's a lot of research on attention.
Okay,
and
sure.
where people look certainly does show you something about what they might be thinking about.
Oh, sure.
For people designing online language courses, I think we need a lot more data about how people learn from a screen.
Yeah.
So it would be really handy to know where they're looking.
And there's a profession of doing this, right? Of course, they're not really interested in how people learn from a screen. They're interested in how people respond to adverts on a screen, and you know, so Facebook, etc., employ huge numbers of people to do this. And if you're a researcher interested in eye tracking, you find that the software is increasingly professionalized and increasingly geared towards, you know, like website viewing and things like that. They have to unpick it.
For learning, we're not interested so much in what would attract your attention in the way advertisers are interested,
of course.
but more about the process of learning, of what needs to follow what in order for you to internalise explicitly and implicitly the information that the course is trying to direct you through.
I mean, eye tracking, it effectively measures what's caught your attention, pretty much, right? And so it wouldn't be the obvious entry point.
I think we've brought up the online medium because it's very useful for gaze.
Right.
It's much more measurable. Trying to measure gaze in a classroom is
you can. I mean,
very difficult.
Technologically, it's not that difficult to measure gaze anyway now.
Okay.
So you can get things which basically feel like eyeglasses, which have a little video camera and then record where you're looking. Okay, so you know, I could be wearing something now, which in this nearly real world context, you know, was recording my gaze the whole time. Right?
And can you do 20 or 30 in the room at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you're limited by money and by person power doing the analyses, because those types of experiment tend to require hand coding. So So
Is it hugely time consuming?
it's not hugely time consuming, but it can be. So it depends basically on how good your object recognition software is. So if you moved a lot, or if we were walking around in a room, so you were against different backgrounds, so here it would be fine, right? Because it's a fairly static image and it would be fairly easy to do.
Most classrooms, they involve the learners moving around a fair bit.
Well, they do, right? And that's the thing. They involve the learners moving around, and we seem to have, certainly in school type classrooms, we no longer have the teacher standing more or less statically, near a blackboard just talking at people or whatever else. Now that would be much easier to analyse. Now, it doesn't mean that the alternative is difficult to analyse. It just means that
I think it's important to be practical in doing research.
Well, you've got to be practical, but sometimes you just need to set up a scenario where the world is the same apart from one parameter which you vary, and observe what happens in those circumstances. Now, you're not claiming that means that that's how social interactions, let's say, happen, but you are demonstrating that the mind, if you like, is sensitive to the variation that you've set up, which is one tiny piece of a very, very big puzzle.
But at least in a classroom, you do have this environment where the input is controlled. You don't know what they're doing outside the classroom, but within the confines of the class, you know the commonality that they're experiencing together within that time period.
You do have some control. I mean, it's what you might call a natural experiment, right?
Yeah, I'm interested in this combination of the experimental research and how to relate it or combine it with classroom environments.
Yeah.
So do you ever triangulate? If you have eye tracking data, do you look at it on different levels?
Well, eye tracking data is very rich. So I mean, we've done things like we've combined other measures as well as eye tracking. So mouse tracking, for example. So the idea being click on the one that's right. Okay. You have to move a mouse to do that, okay? And the movement of the mouse, funnily enough, is quite indicative of your certainty as well, because you tend to accelerate faster towards things you're sure about.
Right, yeah.
And so we were able to compare the very implicit eye tracking, eye movements, to the less implicit mouse movements. But I imagine that if I were a very holistic or even qualitative person, I'd say, well, those are essentially the same. It's just looking at like micro measurements of decision making or whatever. I don't feel I've triangulated very much, but those are my small attempts to do things. And we come back. I mean, what we're really sort of dancing around is that you need a theory, right? It's very, very hard in a very amorphous environment to inductively reason about what's going on. Doesn't mean it's impossible. But
so in classroom environments, we have lots of theories of learning as well as theories of teaching.
Sure, of course.
So the theories of language learning are what the theories of teaching are based on, and then the theories of language testing are based on those two lower levels as well. Yeah. So by the time you're testing, it's getting quite theoretical. And there's a lot underneath.
A lot of degrees of freedom.
We can know a lot more, going back to the data triangulation, looking at data triangulation for time.
Okay.
So if you have the same class every week, as if it's a one sample experiment, quasi-experiment,
okay.
And you can run it in different classes with the same teacher to see what works with different classes.
Okay.
Learners are really different, so you never know what's going to work before
you get random effects.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
But you can be sure over time, with particular classes, what will work better. And that's part of the teacher's experience as a teacher, that they learn what's going to work with what kind of learner, in what kind of context. And it could be totally different for another class or a year or a proficiency level.
Teacher, right?
And another teacher who might implement the same theory, but in a totally different way.
Exactly.
Because we all have different understandings of the same theory.
Yeah. As someone, trying to observe all this data, I mean, what you're really saying is experience trumps empiricism here, right? In some sense, because as humans, we're able to extract meaning from situations in ways which, as scientists, would really like to be able to, but we're not quite there yet, right? So a very experienced classroom teacher is, instinctively getting feedback, if you like, from the class that they're teaching and whatever else.
Can I change instinctively to implicitly as well as explicitly?
Yes, I think both are true. And, it might be an implicit
They
instinct.
learn how to teach over time.
Yeah.
But they also perhaps gain more experience as a language learner themselves to have different ideas of what to work on.
Oh, I think both must be true, but what it suggests is that the data simplification algorithm in their heads, right, is an awful lot more sophisticated than the data simplification algorithms that we could get through eye tracking or through investigation, which we shouldn't be depressed by. It means there's something to aim for, right? But it does mean that a good teacher is still streets ahead of us, perhaps.
I think a good teacher, we can accelerate the process by having good data to base the training on. Eye tracking is incredibly useful, not just, for example, in learning to read. You can learning to read in another language, particularly if it's got a different orthography, is incredibly difficult.
Sure.
And I think we could learn a lot more about how to teach people to learn in another language. So not just online, on screen, not just watching the teacher, what's happening, who are they relating to, but down to basic literacy skills as well.
Okay.